Hi, I'm Alicia Abendroth, and this is Tridge Agri-Insider, your Agri-Food for Thought podcast where we talk about anything and everything agri-food supply chain, brought to you by Tridge. In this heart-wrenching episode of Agri-Insider, we're joined by a special guest from Tel Aviv, where the Israel-Hamas conflict persists. Gil Horsky is founding partner of FLORA VC, an impact investment fund focused on the Israeli and European agri-food ecosystems. Gil provides firsthand insights into the emerging war and the resilience of the incredible Israeli agri-food tech community. Hi, Gil. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's such a pleasure to have you on the show with us.
Thank you so much. Amazing. Super excited to be here.
Awesome. So, today I'm first of all, I'm so excited that you were able to make it onto Agri-Insider. We had planned to speak all about kind of the VC network and generally the kind of ag tech community in Israel and kind of the projects you're working on. But I know, with the current circumstance in Israel, you're calling in from Israel. Some of that will have shifted today. I think, there's some pretty pressing and relevant topics that didn't exist in our world even 2 weeks ago that we definitely also need to mention. So we'll kind of shift the podcast a little bit to also kind of the political dynamics at play. Of course, while you're here, a true legend in the agri space, we also need to pick your brain on kind of agriculture and ag tech communities, ecosystem building out of Israel. But it all goes hand in hand, right? They're not mutually exclusive.
Everything is tied these days. No, for sure.
Amazing. So let's just start at the very kind of beginning. If you could just introduce yourself, tell us a bit about what you do, your background. I think that's a great place to start.
Sure. So I always like to say, I'm obviously originally from Israel, moved in, did the Israeli route. We all go to high school, military. We tend to travel around the world a bit. Did my undergrad in Israel and actually worked a bit in consulting, and then moved to the US to do my MBA. And when I graduated, I always like to say, everybody that studied with me was, I guess, more talented and smarter than me. So everybody wanted to either go to work in McKinsey or Goldman Sachs to be either a consultant or a banker. Nothing against these places. So if there's anybody working in them and listening to this podcast, love both companies, but looked like very boring career paths for me. And was very keen to go to an industry that is still kind of having a very long value chain with general management that has an R&D, and manufacturing and distribution and marketing. And at the same time was looking for something that is a big industry that didn't go through disruption yet that can have a real impact, and decided the food industry looked like an interesting place. So joined the food industry, started my career in Pepsi in the US, in Chicago. I actually was also living already in the city as a student, and joined Pepsi in their healthier businesses, and really learned bottoms up in a bunch of commercial roles, kind of the industry, and had a fantastic time. Really learned what a big industry it is, what a big impact it can have. At that time, there was no food tech, there were no investors. The concept of startups in the food industry, except brands, didn't exist at all. So this whole beautiful ecosystem that we all know so well today didn't exist. Did that for around 5 years, and then had an amazing opportunity to move to Switzerland. And moved to Switzerland, joined Kraft Foods just when they bought Cadbury, was part of that acquisition. And after that, lived in Switzerland for 6 years, doing a global role for Kraft. That later on became Mondelez, and did a lot of roles around strategy, new market entry, innovation, M&A. Did a lot of work in emerging markets like China and India, but also, of course, to Europe. All out of Switzerland. It was a fantastic time. And while I was living in Switzerland, the food industry started changing, and we started having the first incubators, first VCs, first food tech startups and investors. And at that point, I knew that's going to change the industry. I knew there's a huge opportunity here to disrupt the industry. And started on a personal basis, mentoring, helping some early stage entrepreneurs. Was trying to push Mondelez to move in that direction. They were not ready yet. But in 2017, I was keen to move back to Israel after many years abroad. Moved back to Israel. And with the move to Israel, we had a leadership change and was able, with a few colleagues, to co-found the Mandeli Snack Futures team, which is the company's corporate venture arm and also incubation arm that incubated new businesses. Did that for a few years, was initially on the incubation side, building new businesses for the company in the health and wellness space, and then actually moved to lead our venture investments into agri-food tech companies out of Israel, but did that with a global scope. Loved every second of it. Fast forward the beginning of this year, decided it's about time after over 15 years, even more probably, 16 years in big corporate America in the food industry. I felt like I'm ready and it's the right time to move and build my own fund, and moved forward to co-found FLORA Ventures, which we'll obviously elaborate more today.
Amazing. What an incredible career. I think I heard Nestle, PepsiCo, Mandela's. I mean, these are massive multinationals, and you've seen them from the inside, which is incredible. I can only imagine that really had an impact on kind of your decision even now, or what you focus on in FLORA VC. So looking back at that point when you founded FLORA VC, what drove you? I mean, what were you seeing in the industry? And it's interesting because I think from your perspective, because it seems like you were monitoring the startup community. I mean, at its inception, you said, agriculture didn't have startups. And then suddenly it started to evolve, and now you've started a fund, working only with startups. So I guess, what drove you to start FLORA VC?
It's a great question. I think, so seeing this kind of wave, and I think the wave really of new agri-food tech companies and VC, this whole beautiful ecosystem that we know so well, I think really started evolving around 2016, 17. That was the beginning, and probably around 2000, it became kind of a really flourishing ecosystem. I always felt that the early years, I felt like it's very interesting, but I felt like still the ecosystem is still not advanced enough. So meaning there's not enough companies, the technologies are still too early. And actually in the last year, working again in the Mandeli Snack Futures team and seeing that ecosystem from that lens, I started feeling that I think we reached, in every industry, and you see this in every technology, in any industry, it looked like, if you look at the past in fintech and cyber, and I like to look at other industries as an analog to what happens in food and ag, is there's this tipping point where suddenly an investment ecosystem moves from being still a niche in something some of them never evolve, but a lot do, and they reach a tipping point that suddenly the technologies are reaching kind of the Moore law, that they become kind of scalable and efficient in a competitive price point. Regulation is supportive. You start having the right talent base and the right entrepreneurs coming in. And I felt like food and ag finally reached that point in the last year. Now, I would add another angle. I'm a contrarian. I like to think quite differently than where most folks going. And to be honest, in the last few years, until a year ago, as somebody that grew up in the industry, I couldn't justify many times the valuations of the companies. So I love agri-food tech, but it's a tough industry. And there's no quick wins. There's no shortcuts. You cannot build a company that would make $50 million revenue or ARR in 3 years. It just doesn't happen. And the company needs to be built with the right building blocks and with the right valuation and the right fundraising. And the last few years, which were so hot, and food tech became like the new shiny toy for everybody, actually, I think didn't help some of the companies. They were raising too much money and too much high valuations. And when the market collapsed in a way, I actually saw it as a fantastic time to come in. I thought the companies are going to go back to the basics. They're going to focus on revenue, on margin, on quickly reaching the market. And also valuations would be much more competitive. So that was really the tipping point that I thought that is the right time to come in. And it's interesting because obviously it's a harder time to fundraise. As a fund, we also need to fundraise. So it's a harder time. And a lot of people told me, listen, you're a lunatic. Who wants to start a fund now? This is the worst time ever. But I'm actually very confident that it's the right time to start now. And I'm seeing these systematic changes. I mean, I see the level of talent. Today, we see some of the best entrepreneurs. I'm based in Israel, and you said earlier, we have these amazing tech talents that come from the best technological military units or civilian teams. In the past, they all wanted to go to cyber, to fintech. Now they call me on a weekly basis and say, hey, I want to build a company in agri-food tech. And I asked them why. And they said, listen, because I want to build a company that has an impact in a big industry that didn't go through disruption. But a lot of times these folks have the right technological toolboxes, but they don't know the industry. They don't know which problems they're trying to solve. So that's where we try to help them. The same as with the technology. If we look at fermentation and cell-based and a lot of other technologies, I mean, a few years ago, they looked very far away from the market. Now they're slowly getting closer to market, both with the right regulatory framework and with the scale. And then we're seeing some beautiful technologies and business models coming from other industries into food. Fintech models, SaaS, AI, image recognition, generative and AI. A lot of these things are moving finally into food. And there's this famous study from McKinsey a few years ago that talks about the 5 biggest industries, and then it ranks them by size and then by level of digitization. And agri-food tech is ranked the lowest. So meaning it's the least digitized industry. There's a lot of potential here. So I think those have been some of the reasons that have really kind of pushed me to say this is the right time to do it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, especially on the front of the valuations. I think that really resonated with me. Agriculture is traditionally, and I've had many speakers come on who've said, it's such a tough industry, such tight margins, right? And now you've got the kind of VC, startup innovation space trying to take something that's so fragile, so delicate, right? On working on such tight margins and revolutionize it. And, when you kind of think about it, it's almost like an impossible task, and it takes someone with a lot of skill set and, like you said, background, industry knowledge to actually, I think, invest properly in that industry or in the agricultural industry. So it sounds like you've really kind of tapped a niche even with your fund, working truly on projects that, I mean, maybe I should ask you this. From my perception, not a lot of VCs want to touch agriculture, actually, right? So.
Right. So yeah, you're right. So we do both food and ag. So we invest across the value chain of food and agriculture. And it's interesting. You're raising an interesting point. It's investment is also a bit of a world of hype, right? Certain things become one day super hot and the next day less, which we can all kind of sometimes laugh about. But I feel like ag tech was a bit earlier than food. There was a bit of ag tech investors. There were a bit of startups. Food became really hot in the last 5 years, a lot with alternative proteins and plant-based, etc. And it was interesting because I felt that until a year ago, food was so hot that a lot of the folks that used to do ag tech were kind of almost disappointed and saying, oh, nobody cares about agriculture. Let's start doing more food. And I have some friends in the US that are pure ag tech funds, fantastic funds that kind of started pivoting into food. But actually, the last 18 months, with a few big, actually, geopolitical events around us. I mean, if we think about it, COVID, the war in Ukraine, and actually the whole climate crisis, all of these events actually brought agriculture, I mean, the whole industry, but even more agriculture than food to the forefront. It suddenly became a topic that, you buy. I'm actually looking here. I used to have somewhere a copy. Oh, yeah, I didn't need it. I still have it here, so that's good. I'm looking for it. Yeah, I have this Economist from a year ago called "The Coming Food Catastrophe." That was it was written exactly, I think, when the Ukraine war started. We would never be at the front of the Economist. This would never be the hottest topic that people would talk about in a cocktail party. But suddenly, everybody talks about agriculture, and I think that actually, again, in the conversation about trends, actually. Agriculture, I feel at the moment is becoming again a hot topic from an investment perspective, even more than food. Again, these things can change. We as the fund do both. Our thesis is we invest in Israeli and European companies, and we want to help early stage companies. So we do pre-seed, seed, and A, and we want to help these companies scale abroad, mainly to the US and Asia. We believe that the good companies out of Israel and Europe that are need to scale globally to bigger markets. And we specifically look at companies on the value chain of food and agriculture that are either touching the world of what we call planetary health. So it could be everything related to climate, but in the lens of agri-food. So it could be regenerative agriculture, could be sustainable packaging, could be green fertilizers and green ammonia, or using waste streams and circular economy, or the other, in addition to planetary health, and could be human health. So if we think about it, food is the number one cause of death. I mean, that, at the end of the day, food and diet, one way or another, impact almost everything around our health. So we are very interested in the topic of food as medicine, sugar reduction, personalized nutrition. So those would be kind of the two theses we look at. And specifically, we can talk about it a bit more. We have a strong interest in agriculture. One, because Israel has and we can talk about it as we kind of move forward, Israel has a big heritage in agriculture. But the second piece is we have is a fund, and we talked about this publicly when we announced our first closing a few months ago. One of our biggest LPs and investors are the Israeli kibbutzim, and they come from agriculture. And I think, maybe I'll let you kind of ask me a few more questions, but I'm happy to elaborate for those that don't know what is a kibbutz, because that is actually a very strong link to agriculture.
Yeah, and I think it also ties into your upbringing and kind of your heritage, right? And I mean, not to segue too much, but I am kind of curious, and I do usually ask this a little earlier on. You mentioned, though, you kind of grew up in agriculture, and you grew up in you grew up in Israel, but maybe this ties into the kibbutzim kind of question as well. But is there a heritage link there? Is that all connected? I mean, yeah.
So I personally, I can't take credit. I didn't grow up in a farm, unfortunately. Maybe I wish, but so I don't have a family's history personally in the agricultural side. I do have in the food side a bit. My grandparents on my mother's side actually had the first bakery in one of the large Israeli cities, but that was before I was born. So that's the strongest historical connection I can find. But as you rightfully said, is growing up in Israel as a country. I mean, Israel is a tiny country, right? It's 10 million people, very small size-wise. I mean, tiny. I believe you're sitting in Germany. I think it's like a tenth of the size of Bavaria, so it's a very small country size-wise.
Yeah.
And smaller by than almost any, if not all, the U.S. states. So it's a very small space. But actually, the interesting thing about Israel is, although the landscape and the size is so small, the landscape, you have all different landscapes in different topography from an agricultural perspective across a small space. So a third of the country is a desert, right? It's the famous Negev desert. So you have there a desert, then you have the sea. So there's a lot of agriculture around the sea. Then you have the Golan and the Galilee, the north, you have hills and mountains. And actually the kibbutz